By the 16th century, following the expulsion of the Jewish community of Spain, world Jewry became split, bifurcated between the Sfaradim, inhabiting the many lands of Ottoman rule, and the Ashkenazim of Europe. The greatest population center of which was in Poland. Jewish autonomy was well established in Poland, given the residence right bestowed by the kings. They were independent of city jurisdiction and taxation. The Jews basically comprised a nation within a nation. They were governed by the Council of the Four Lands, to which the various Jewish communities sent representatives for periodic meetings. Its code, the authoritative Shulchan Aruch, which we'll talk about later. Ottoman Jewry, however, was a world apart. Its spiritual center during the 1500s wasn't Constantinople or Jerusalem, but Safed or Tzfat. This wasn't a biblical town, though there had been a Jewish community there dating back to Talmudic times. The conquest of Safed or Tzfat by the Mamluks during the 1200s had brought about a revival of Jewish settlement. It was described as a city peopled by Jews from all over the world. From 1500 to 1550, the Jewish population grew from 300 families to 716. In 1524, Tzfat became the residence of halachist and communal leader Jacob Berab, who had been expelled from Spain, later becoming the rabbi of Fez. The poverty and harsh conditions of the Spanish exiles fed his mystical impulse. In time, he became the head of Tzfat's community of scholars. In 1536, Berab was joined by Joseph ben Ephraim Caro, whom he ordained as a rabbi 2 years later. Caro subsequently became the head of Safed's or Tzfat's scholars, having already become deeply involved in his monumental work, Bet Yosef. Here was a comparison of halachic writings from Talmudic times to his own century, drawing on both Ashkenazic and Sephardic sources. He harmonized the rulings of Rambam, Rashi, and others, aiming to produce one law and one Torah. It was about 10 years later, 1565, that Caro produced the Shulchan Aruch, a practical guide in almanac form, with some later commentaries, especially of Moses Isserlis, a 16th century Polish Ashkenazi rabbi. To this day, it remains an authoritative statement of Orthodox Judaism. It made it possible to be strictly observant even without great learning or interpretive skills, though it eventually became so highly revered that it acted as a barrier to any kind of flexibility. Before coming to Palestine, Caro studied Kabbalah with Solomon ben Moses Alkabetz. Alkabetz probably preceded Caro to Tzfat, arriving around 1535. Caro headed a yeshiva in Tzfat, while Alkabetz directed a yeshiva at nearby Meron, the burial place of Shimon Bar Yochai. Alkabetz's brother-in-law, Moses ben Yaakov Cordovero, studied Talmud with Caro, being fascinated by the hidden wisdom of the Zohar. He grappled with the central problem of Kabbalah, God's relationship to creation, as elaborated in the theory of 10 sephirot, or emanations. It seems that eruptions of Jewish and Christian mysticism were sometimes simultaneous and interrelated. For example, the Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart couldn't have known about the Zohar, but he was interested in Jewish writings. It's worth pointing out that the very word Kabbalah denotes a revelation, something received. Mysticism certainly hadn't held a high place in Jewish culture during earlier periods. The Torah, after all, has a sternly rationalistic spirit, being the possession of all Jews. Kabbalah was revealed only to a small number of saints, or kedoshim, who transmitted it to their disciples. But Kabbalah had an important role in the formation of spiritual culture beyond history and reason. Words were denied their literal meaning. Letters were given numerical values, a subdiscipline called gematria. We can see in all of it a response to the misery and insecurity that often characterized life in such troubled times. A new and better life was instead created in the world of imagination. Though Kabbalah often led to superstition, it also found eloquent expression in poetry. There was also a consciousness of the imminent coming of the Mashiach, the Messiah. By drawing closer to God, Jews could influence the Almighty to expedite sending a Redeemer at the end of days. As the 16th century wore on, students of Kabbalah turned increasingly to eschatology. A prime example was Isaac ben Solomon Luria, who lived from 1534 to 1572. He was so revered as to be called in Hebrew Ha'ari, the lion. It's an abbreviation of Ha'elohi Rabbi Yitzchak, the divine rabbi. He was the son of an Ashkenazi father and a Sephardic mother, and arrived in Sfat in 1569. He studied briefly with Cordovero, but expounded his own system, his Lurianic system, which focused on a passionate longing for the Messiah and an awareness of the collective responsibility of the Jewish people to hasten his coming through steadfast faith and practice. There were three main parts central to his teaching. Part one, tzimtzum, or contraction. In the beginning, there was only God. But in order for the material world to exist, God had to contract the divine presence to make room for it. As creation proceeds, God creates a vessel that can receive pure divine light. The light pours into the vessel, but the vessel cannot contain the magnitude of this light, and it shatters. Then there's part two, called in Hebrew Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. The broken shards are scattered everywhere in a big bang of creation. Part three is the job of humanity, to locate and gather these shards and make the vessel, our world, whole again. The Kabbalists called this fixing, this mending, Tikkun Olam, or the repair of the world. Any act of goodness, altruism, kindness that contributes to that idea is considered Tikkun Olam. It's an extraordinary idea that we can restore what has been shattered. In fact, it's our responsibility to try. One Friday night, Luria led his disciples out of Tzfat to welcome the Sabbath. Suddenly, he interrupted his prayers to ask his disciples whether at that moment they would like to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Sabbath there. His disciples hesitated and said they would have to tell their wives. Luria declared, "Oy lanu, anu lo ro'im, ra'iti et HaMashiach, asher od me'at yigale b'Yerushalayim,
ואילו הסכמתם לבוא מיד, היינו נגאלים מגאולתנו בתפוצה.
Of course, they were not redeemed. As the 17th century wore on, Kabbalistic Messianism dovetailed with shock over the Cossack massacres of Polish Jews who had settled in Ukraine in 1648. The result? Many leaders of the Council of the Four Lands were lost. The Polish leaders pressured the council to raise money to fight the Russians, the Cossacks, the Swedes, and the Turks, which in the end crippled the council financially. The Jewish communities quarreled over the crushing burden of taxation. The Poles ultimately abolished the Council of the Four Lands, along with the Lithuanian Council in 1764. Jews would now pay a head tax directly to the Polish state. Such burdens were proof that the end of days was near. This was all part of Chevlei HaMashiach, the pangs of the Messiah. In 1665, when the massacres in Poland were ending, a Turkish Jew named Shabbetai Tzvi proclaimed that he was the Mashiach, the Messiah.
Some scholars regard him as a charlatan and a fraud. Others presume that he was mentally deranged. They grant him sincere belief in his own messianic pretensions. He may have proclaimed his messiahship as early as 1648, when news of the Polish massacres reached his native Smyrna. In 1663, he was living in Jerusalem as an eccentric and an ascetic. He attracted the notice of a rabbi, Kabbalist, Nathan of Gaza. 2 years later, Nathan began to style himself as a prophet, convinced through a vision of Shabbatai's messianic identity.
Nathan and Shabbetai made the great proclamation at Gaza on May 31st, 1665. Next, Nathan sent a series of epistles broadcasting the message throughout the diaspora. There had been many messianic pretenders in the past, but there had never been one who had united the Jewish people of all lands in such a way. In September of 1665, Shabbetai returned triumphantly to Smyrna, from which he had been banned by the rabbis a decade earlier. Nathan then circulated a long letter prophesying the future course of events.
A year and a few months from today, Shabbetai will take the dominion from the Turkish king without war, for by the power of hymns and praises which he shall utter, all nations shall submit to his rule. He will take the Turkish king along to the countries which he will conquer, and all the kings shall be tributary unto him. But only the Turkish king will be his servant.
A circular letter was also sent by Shabbatai's secretary, Samuel Primo, to Jewish communities everywhere, making the bold claim that Shabbetai Tzvi was the Messiah.
The first begotten Son of God, Shabbetai Tzvi, Messiah and Redeemer of the people of Israel, to all the sons of Israel, Shalom. Since you have been deemed worthy to behold the great day and the fulfillment of God's word by the prophets, your lament and sorrow must be changed into joy, and your fasting into merriment. For you shall weep no more. Rejoice with song and melody, and change the day formerly spent in sadness and sorrow into a day of jubilee, because I have appeared.
Jews throughout the diaspora in Central and Eastern Europe, London, Amsterdam, Italy, Macedonia, Morocco, and Egypt began purifying themselves for the day of redemption. They sold their houses and lands and all their possessions, expecting any day the signal to sail to the Holy Land. But the signal never came. Many decided not to wait. Shabbetai himself got ready for the journey from Smyrna to Constantinople, the Turkish capital. Jews began streaming toward Palestine, part of the ingathering of the exiles. In 1666, the Turks perceived a threat of insurrection, and they intercepted Shabbetai on the Sea of Marmara. He was taken in chains to Constantinople, where he was confined to a cell and allowed to receive visitors. It was reported that he was performing miracles, all part of the grand design. In September of 1666, he was hauled before the Turkish court, forced to choose between Islam or death.
Choose Allah or die.
Shabbetai chose Allah. He took the name of Aziz Mehmed Effendi and accepted a royal pension of 150 piastres a day. Some Jews likewise chose conversion to Islam. Others decided that this was one more part of the mystery to be revealed. For many, there was nothing left but despair. This was especially true in Poland, where spiritual ruin turned to spiritual desolation.
What do you think, Watson? How many modern expressions of Messianism are there? Would it even be proper to call Superman, which was, after all, the creation of a couple of Jewish gents from Cleveland, an expression of modern messianic longing?
In a more serious context of intellectual life in the 17th century, the tendency for individualism and dissent was expressed by philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who lived in Amsterdam in the middle of the 17th century. He had long been a member of the Sephardi congregation, living a life of sobriety and integrity as a lens grinder, seeking only a quiet life of lonely contemplation. In any case, he revolted against Jewish orthodoxy.
How should we evaluate Spinoza on the scale of religion? Spinoza was, on the one hand, a non-religious Jew, though he certainly wasn't an anti-religious Jew. In fact, he's been described as a God-intoxicated man. He believed that all should be free to pursue inquiries about nature, whatever the conclusions led them, without any religious dogma. The real value and essence of religion lay in ethical and human content, pursuing justice, truth, and compassion. Is that properly considered heretical in terms of Jewish thought? Now there's an issue.
Spinoza essentially embraced pantheism, a total identification of the reality of God with the reality of the universe. Such a God could be admired, but never hears or answers personal prayer. For Spinoza, as with Einstein centuries later, God is everything. Whatever is in God, and nothing can either be or be conceived without God. There is no plan or purpose behind human or historical events. God acts from the laws of his own nature only. This amounts to a thorough determinism. In nature, there is nothing contingent, but all things are determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and act in a certain manner. When Einstein was asked, "Do you believe in God?" his response was, I believe in Spinoza's God. Spinoza's masterwork, published in 1674, was called Ethics, demonstrated with geometrical order. It proceeds proposition by proposition, like a geometry text. Ethical truths are said to have mathematical precision.
I do not presume that I have found the best philosophy. I know that I understand the true philosophy. If you ask in what way I know it, I answer in the same way as you know that 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles.
He was in tune with the rationalism of his contemporaries, Descartes and Newton, and similar to Rambam and Saadia Gaon in applying scientific method to the problem of faith. But there was also a great distinction between Spinoza and Talmudic dialectic, and for that reason he was excluded and excommunicated from the Jewish community. The verdict against him read as follows.
Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. We order that nobody should communicate with him orally or in writing, or show him any favor, or stay with him under the same roof, or read anything composed or written by him.
Such dissension within Jewish ranks is but a melancholy foretaste of things to come. Stay tuned.